Welcome. We are going to talk in this lecture about different theisms or different theistic belief systems, and I trust you will find this very interesting. Let me find my cursor here. There we go. All right, put myself in the corner here so we can see our page. First of all, most people understand what monotheism is. Monotheism is a belief that only one God exists. Now, interesting to stress this a little bit, because if you happen to be, for instance, a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, and you see the foundation of your religious tradition as being in the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament, you might think that your religion's always been about monotheism. But as a matter of fact, monotheism is only about 2,600 years old. And when you talk about ancient Israelite religion, before that time, it's clearly not monotheistic. Case in point, Moses, somewhere around 3,400 years ago, give or take, is leading the children of Israel, as we call them, hundreds of thousands of Israelites who have been enslaved in Egypt. They've lived there for 430 years, the greatest part of that as slaves. And after a number of mighty miracles, Moses is leading them out of captivity in Egypt. He's leading them to a place we call the Promised Land. And the reason we call that is because it was promised by God to Abraham about 600 years before that. God told Abraham that he would give him a multitude of descendants, and he would give his descendants this land forever. So Moses has showed up to take them to this land that was promised to Abraham. But he tells them, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not worship the gods of the Canaanites. Now, one might make a good case just from that command that clearly these people must think that other gods exist. But the best evidence for it is that when they get into the land the Lord their God is giving them, they do exactly what they're not supposed to do. They worship these other gods, many of them. And idolatry is a big problem for a good 800 years or so. We don't see them becoming monotheistic until much later, about the 6th century BCE, when they're coming back from a captivity in Babylon after the Persian king Cyrus the Great defeats Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And when they come back to their land, for the first time we see they are properly monotheistic, and never again is idolatry a problem. So this is when monotheism begins, but obviously this history goes way back before monotheism has ever existed. Now you can sit, in synagogue or church or a mosque all your life and never really be told this. But when you think about it, and that monotheism is a belief that only one God exists, then it's indisputable that these people are not monotheists. So we're going to talk a little bit later about what they are, because they've got this unusual situation where all these gods exist, but they've got a command that they're only supposed to worship their God and not any of the other gods. And we have a special name for this, which you'll see is called Henotheism. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about polytheism, because this will give us a good foundation to talk about it. Now, polytheism, many gods exist, and you can choose whichever ones you want to worship. Some decisions are better than others, but which god to worship is really common sense. You have to be pretty stupid to make a bad decision most of the time. Nobody would go to their dentist and ask their dentist how much he would charge to change the oil in their automobile, because everybody's smart enough to know that dentists don't do automotive work. By the same token, nobody would go to Jiffy Lube and ask them how much they would charge to do a root canal. Boy, that would be scary, wouldn't it? See them come out with a mechanic's drill. But we all know this, right? If I want to plant an organic garden in my backyard, I'm not going to call up retired General David Petraeus. That's not his forte. Now, if I want to invade a third world country, David Petraeus is your man. So we all have some idea that different people have different services, have different expertise, have different areas where they have a service to provide. In society, people have different areas of influence, different areas of power, different responsibilities. We understand how this works. So polytheism is born after what we call the agricultural revolution, where humans have learned how to make crops grow where they want them to be. They've learned how to curtail the grazing ranges of the animals, and this begins about 10,000 BCE or so in the area that becomes Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, and goes back almost as far in the area that is today Israel. When human society becomes stable, becomes sedentary, they're staying in one place, they have to defend this land that is theirs, and they build cities with city walls, and tribes amalgamate. There have to be enough people to defend the city. And for the first time, people have different vocations. Not everybody does the same thing. They're not all hunter-gatherers anymore. And so for the first time, we have social stratification. That means society is in layers. And the people that occupy the highest layers generally don't have much to do with the people that occupy the lowest layers, except as business necessitates. And this is the beginning of a stratified society that is based on vocational diversity, okay? Diversity of labor. Not everybody does the same thing. So humans at this time start to imagine a community of the gods, and they imagine that the gods exist in a similar kind of relationship to their society. Humans can only imagine the best thing they can imagine, and at this point, this kind of society is the best thing they can imagine. So they imagine gods that have family relationships, gods that have different vocations, different natural forces or areas that they have power over. And so polytheism is going to make a lot of sense, as you'll see. Now let me say this. The many gods in polytheism are generally associated one of four different ways. This isn't going to be on your screen here, so you might want to jot it down. The first is natural forces, powers in the universe. Second is geography or topography, areas of the earth. The third is nations or tribes or peoples. And the fourth is occupation or profession. Now, just to give you an example, gods can apply to different categories. Take the ancient god of the sea, Poseidon. He falls in three categories decisively. He almost makes it in all four categories. Poseidon is, first of all, god of the sea, and the sea is certainly a natural force. In fact, there are entire civilizations destroyed by tidal waves. Okay, one thinks of the Minoans. The sea is also certainly a geographic area. I mean, there's more water surface on Earth than anything else. Poseidon also is a god very important to certain occupations. If you happen to be a merchant and you're transporting goods by ship, the god of the sea is going to be very important to you. If you happen to be a fisherman, if you happen to be a naval soldier or a naval officer where you do battle on the sea and spend a lot of your life on a ship, Poseidon is going to be very important to you. And Poseidon almost makes it to the fourth category where he becomes the god of a people. In ancient Greek mythology, there's a competition between Poseidon and Athena to see who is going to be the patron deity of this new polis. And Athena wins, which is why it's called Athens. If Poseidon had won, I don't know what you would call it, Poseidia or something like that, but if he had won, my point is, Poseidon would have transcended all four categories, okay? He would be a god of natural forces, a god of geographic area, a god of tribes or peoples, and a god of occupation. But he ends up being a god of three. This makes perfect sense. Now, let me explain a few situations to explain how easy it is to imagine what you are going to do here. If you live in the United States of America, as I do, you are probably not that concerned what the laws of Pakistan are like, because I don't have to live by them. I do have to live by the laws of the United States of America, but I'm not trying to live by the laws of Pakistan. However, if I move to Pakistan, either temporarily or permanently, I'm going to be very, very concerned with following the laws of the land of Pakistan because I live there. So this is my first example. If you live in Athens, you're probably not really concerned with worshiping the gods of Sparta because you don't live in Sparta. In fact, in many cases, Sparta is seen as your enemy. However, if something happens in my life where I have to take a journey and I have to travel through Sparta, I am certainly going to make my peace with the god of Sparta because I want to be able to go through his land safely and exit with my life. Imagine that you're a farmer You've never really worshipped Poseidon. You've never been on the sea in your life. But all of a sudden, a nearby volcano starts spitting fire, and it's erupting, and all of you go running for the ships to go out to sea. You may be in a hurry, but somewhere on your way to the ship, if you're smart, you're going to stop and you're going to make some kind of an offering to Poseidon, because you want to make sure that Poseidon knows who you are and is on your side when you get out on the water where he is in control. Make sense? Now, let's talk about this another way. We have gods of agriculture. We have gods of natural forces. We also have war gods. Let's go back to think about the Hebrews, or Israelites, you can call them either one at this point, who are leaving Egypt, following Moses, who is leading them to the land of Canaan, or Canaan, today called Israel, that was promised to Abraham. That's why we call it the Promised Land, as I mentioned before. When they get into the land they're going to be inheriting, they're in a very different situation than they were before then. Before then, they were involved in a lot of battles. And their God did many miracles. Their God fought for them. Their God defended them. And they're very grateful to this God called Yahweh. Yahweh is seen primarily as a war god, probably, because that's what he does. I mean, he kicks butt, and he does it really well. And he defends these people and champions these people, protects these people. When they get into their land, they spend time fighting other battles to take over the land. Finally, though, there comes a point where the land has been subdued, whether through military action or through truces they've made with some of the tribes there in Canaan. And now they're building homes and they're planting crops. And at this point, they really need to pay attention to some other gods. They certainly need to be friendly with the gods of the land because they're living in that land and they want to be blessed. They certainly are paying attention to the agricultural gods and the nature gods because, they need the rains, they need the sun, they need their plants to grow. They want their, cattle to reproduce. And so they end up focusing on these gods that are directly related to what they're trying to accomplish, and they're not focused on their war god anymore because they're not fighting a battle. Now, if you read in the book of Judges, in the Hebrew Bible, you'll see the theological import of this is that after they get in the land, they start worshiping the gods of the land. So God is angry, he removes his protection, and then they end up being attacked. And, maybe it's the Midianites or the Philistines or somebody comes against the Israelites. And they cry out to God and come back to the Lord their God. Again, this is the theological import in the Bible. They come back to their God, and so God forgives them, raises up a leader, we call him a judge, and defends them from their enemies. And of course, they're very, very grateful. But give them just a few decades, and they'll be back to worshiping all of these other gods again. Now, I remember when I was a little guy sitting in Sunday school class, elementary school, sitting in Sunday school class in a Presbyterian church, and I couldn't help but think that sin or rebellion against God must make you exceedingly stupid, because it seemed to me that these people should have gotten a clue before they did. Of course, later on, I actually got a few degrees and studied the ancient cultures and realized that I didn't understand everything. Whatever the theological import is, these stories make perfect sense. When you're not fighting a battle, you're focused on the gods that are most relevant to what you're doing. Agriculture. But as soon as somebody attacks you, nobody's doing any farming anymore until the battle is over. People are taking their bronze farming tools and they're beating their hoes into agricultural hoes, not women. They're beating their hoes into swords and hatchets, whatever, to go to battle. And so who are they immediately going to start worshiping and praying to and sacrificing to again? Their war god, because they got to go to war. And once they're done fighting a battle, they remain appreciative for a while, but after they've lived in peace for a couple decades, they're kind of forgetting about the war god. My point is this. It's not to take away from the theological import of the Bible at all. I'm just saying that even without the theological import, if you understand the nature of polytheism, this makes perfect sense. Now, the problem is this. If they're polytheistic, why do they have this rule that they can only worship this one God? This seems completely illogical. If somebody told you, hey, you can go to your dentist for everything. If you need to draw up a will, go to your dentist. If you need to go grocery shopping, go to your dentist. If your car needs fixed, go to your dentist. If you need a new wardrobe, Go to your dentist. Your dentist can do everything. This would be completely illogical. This is just how illogical monotheism is to these people. Now, we have a period here, and this is where henotheism comes in. We have a period of a good 800 years or so. It's kind of like the middle ground between polytheism and what becomes monotheism in the Middle East. And we call it henotheism. And this is a period where many gods still exist, and obviously the people believe this, but the community's ideal is that they only worship their own. They don't worship these other gods. We call this henotheism. For henotheism to exist, there must be two criteria. One is that multiple gods must exist, but secondly, there must be some kind of a rule, some kind of a standard about which gods you must worship and which you must not. Perfectly describes ancient Israel. They clearly believe many gods exist, but they have a rule that they are only supposed to worship their own. And they find it very difficult to do that because this doesn't make much sense to them. So in a sense, what's happening is they are functioning like polytheists when henotheism is the ideal. And there's a term for this. We call it idolatry. Now, idolatry, the classic definition of idolatry, is worshiping the wrong god. Everybody immediately says, yes, that makes sense. I just want you to realize we've redefined the word idolatry today. And the reason is because idolatry in the classic sense no longer applies. At least it doesn't apply much in America here. Nobody is standing outside the temple of Dionysus or something with signs going, don't worship here, he's a false god. We don't have this kind of issue going on today. You cannot commit idolatry in the classic sense if there's only one God, because there's no wrong God to worship. Make sense? So you cannot commit idolatry, and again, this is the classic sense of the word, worshiping the wrong God. You cannot commit idolatry in monotheism. You also cannot commit idolatry in polytheism, because in polytheism, you're the one that makes the choice what god or gods you're going to worship. It might go well for you, it might go badly for you, you'll find out later on, but still it's your choice. When you add the idea that there are multiple gods, but you have a rule which gods you must worship, that's what we call henotheism. You can only commit idolatry in henotheism, because again, there have to be multiple gods, or you can't worship the wrong one, and there must be some rule about which god you're supposed to worship, or again, you can't worship the wrong one. So only in henotheism can you commit idolatry in the classic sense of the word. There comes a period of time when what was Israel, we're going to call it Judah at the time, and later on we'll talk about why the name changes. Israel is actually a collection of 12 tribes. One of those tribes is Judah. But later on, after a civil war and a separation, and a good part of the Israelites being destroyed by the Assyrians, most of what is left is from the tribe of Judah, or is dwelling in the land that they preside over. And so we talk about Judah or Judea from a certain point on. Not important for you to know that now. But as I did mention before, it's in the 6th century BCE, 2,600 years ago, when the Jews, or Judahites, if you will, Yehudas, returned from captivity in Babylon under the reign of the new Persian king Cyrus the Great, that they come home monotheists. And we've never seen this before. But they come home with very, very different ideas, that only one God exists, and for the first time they believe there's a battle going on between God and Satan, and there's angels and demons fighting each other, and for the first time they are developing these doctrines about resurrection of the dead, final judgment, heaven and hell. These are all brand new ideas. You can read through all the books of Moses. You can read through Joshua and Judges, and you're not going to find any notion there of everybody being resurrected from the dead, standing in a final judgment, going to heaven, going to hell. None of these ideas exist anywhere. These ideas come with monotheism, again, about 2,600 years ago. Okay, makes sense? So once we get to that point, henotheism is done. Henotheism does not exist in any of the major world religions today, at least not as I've defined it. I've defined it as an exclusive henotheism, where you're forbidden to worship other gods. You have to worship only yours. I've heard people apply the term in other ways. I don't think that's a wise use of the word, okay? If we change the meaning of this word, then we'll have to come up with another one to talk about ancient Israel. So Henotheism doesn't exist today in any of the world religions, but why is it so important to understand? Because it is foundational in the development of your religion if you happen to be one of the three main monotheistic religions today. Henotheism is that period of time as polytheism is on its way to becoming monotheism. Henotheism in the Middle East is kind of the middle ground there. You'll see this in the understanding of battles. I mean, Israel goes to war against the Philistines, and they feel like their god Yahweh is fighting the Philistine god Dagon. And if they win the battle, they feel like Yahweh kicked Dagon's butt. This is all henotheistic thinking. So anyway, actually this could be polytheistic thinking too. But the idea is here that henotheism is very important to understand when you want to look at the foundations of monotheism. And let's move on here now, and we are going to talk about something else that happens in the same period that monotheism is born, about 2,600 years ago. This is a period that Karl Jaspers, a German scholar, called this the axial age, because in major civilizations all over the world, people seem to be taking some kind of almost an evolutionary leap philosophically in the way they think about ultimate reality, in the way they think about what the human being is and how the human being is connected with this ultimate reality. And we'll discuss this more later on. But suffice to say, this is the era when monotheism is born. Monotheism is originally born in Persia, modern-day Iran, in a religion called Zoroastrianism. But over the centuries, Zoroastrianism changes quite a lot, kind of diverts from classic monotheism, and today there's almost no Zoroastrianism left. It pertains to a very small community of people, which is why we don't really consider it a major world religion. But suffice to say that when the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, the Jews in exile were exposed to Zoroastrianism, so it's very interesting that when the Jews come back to their land, they have a lot of these same ideas that the Zoroastrians had, like resurrection from the dead, final judgment, heaven and hell, the idea there's a God, there's some kind of an evil nemesis. The Persians call him Ahriman, or I'm going to mine you. That's Satan. So all of these things are brand new. Now here's what's interesting. In India, they also develop a form of monotheism. But it's a very different kind of monotheism, and so we have a special term for it. We call it monism. The reason, monotheism literally means one godism, whereas monism just means oneism. Now, there's two aspects of this, flip sides of the same coin, if you will. They believe, and again, this is less than the 1% of the deep thinkers or philosophers, theologians thinking at this time, but eventually everybody in society over the centuries kind of grasped this idea that the ultimate reality, in a sense, is one. And there is one God, God with a big, big capital G, that is beyond all comprehension, beyond the universe, beyond space, beyond time, beyond human comprehension. And this ultimate God is generally called Brahman. However, the Indians do not get rid of all of the other thousands of gods, like they do in Persia and like they do in Judah or Judea. What the Indians do is, because their idea of the ultimate God is transcendent beyond our comprehension, they believe that all of the personal gods are actually manifestations, if you will, of the ultimate God. Because we can't even think about what the ultimate God is. The highest life form we can think of is personhood. So we need all of these personal gods, their representations, their manifestations, their incarnations of Brahman. So for now, we'll get more into this later, but for now, the implications, for instance, would be, let's say my family and I, we worship the god Vishnu. Your family worships the god Shiva. Our friend John worships the goddess Durga, Kali, whatever. It's okay. They're all manifestations of Brahman, and all of them can help us in our spiritual quest towards our ultimate goal, which is to be with God forever, much like the monotheistic religions. The main difference in Hinduism is that it takes multiple lifetimes to get there. They have a belief in reincarnation. but the ultimate goal is the same. So if a Hindu tells you they're a monotheist, believe them. They're telling the truth. It's just a different kind of monotheism where they believe that all the different gods are really manifestations of the one ultimate, transcendent, unknowable God. And sometimes they'll even call Brahman the great unknowable, big capital U. So again, this kind of monotheism we call monism. There's one ultimate transcendent reality beyond all dualism. Many gods may exist, but they're all manifestations of the one. We're not going to talk too much about pantheism. Very, very little. Pantheism, however, is a belief that God is the sum total of all that exists. And we will talk a little bit about it more later, but I don't need to discuss it much now. Panentheism is kind of like a middle ground between pantheism and monotheism. To explain what panentheism is, I need to explain a little bit about what it has in common with monotheism and what it doesn't. Monotheism in general believes in a God that has no limitations, a God that is infinite. So if God has no boundaries, no limitations, if God is infinite, then there is no place where God doesn't exist. There is no time where God doesn't exist. In fact, everything exists in God. A good example of this is in the 5th book in the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul is reasoning with some of the philosophers on the Areopagus, also called Mars Hill. Ares and Mars are the same god of war. But he's actually quoting from a Greek poet to make a point about the nature of our relationship with God. And he says, in him we live and move and have our being. That's classic monotheism. Everything exists in God. Okay? Panentheists would believe the same exact thing. Everything exists in God. Here's the difference. In classic monotheism, there are certain attributes of God. I won't discuss them all now, but let me just give you 3 of the higher attributes. One of them is that God is omniscient. That's like saying omniscience. Omni means all. Science is knowing or knowledge. So God knows everything. God can't learn anything new. God is also thought to be omnipotent. Potence meaning power or strength. He is all-powerful. And by the way, the flip side of that is sovereign. All-powerful, in control of everything. Nothing out of his control. Thirdly, God is thought to be unchanging and immutable. There is nothing that can make God better or make God worse. God is what God is. There are no conditions that change in any way who or what God is. So these are 3 of the classic higher attributes of God in monotheism. Well, the problem with panentheism is while panentheism thinks the whole universe exists in God, panentheism imagines a God that has created the universe in himself, obviously. It's become a part of God. And when God has put the natural powers in place, one of the forces of nature that God creates is us, human beings. And he creates a race of beings that will evolve to the point where they can actually change the nature of their universe. And we've gotten to that point now. I mean, we're to the point now where we could blow up the entire earth and end human life as we know it. So the idea here is that God is watching us intently. He's very interested in our story, of course, hoping we'll do good things. But as we make these decisions, God is learning for the first time what we will do and either rejoicing in it or feeling sorrow, I suppose. And as we are changing the world, we are in fact changing God because the world is part of God. Now, this way of looking at God makes God seem very personal, very involved in your life, very concerned, and you might like this idea of the humane God, but it does violate these 3 higher attributes of God, because God is no longer all-knowing, because he's finding out what we're going to do that changes the world that's in him. He's no longer all-powerful, because he's left some things out of his control, obviously, and he's no longer unchangeable, because if the universe is in fact God or is in God, as we're changing the universe, then in a sense, we're changing God. So Panentheism is not really a religion per se. You're not going to find the first church of Panentheism down the street, but it is a philosophical point of view that if you want to learn more about, it's easy enough to Google it. If you're taking REL 2000, if you're taking REL 2300, this is not true, but if you're taking REL 2000, we're actually going to talk more about Panentheism later on in the semester. Deism is important. In the Enlightenment period, you all hopefully have heard something about this, but we really see it getting started in the 1700s, or maybe a little before that. But this is the period where religion is beginning to be marginalized. The church in Europe, the Christian church, is no longer seen as the authoritative center of all society. Now, this change happened slowly over the centuries with an awful lot of conflict. Many people die trying to assert that the church should not be treated with the same kind of reverent authority. But in a sense, what's happening here, and the Protestant Reformation has a lot to do with really getting the ball rolling here, is the church is being challenged. The church is being challenged because the church is no longer necessarily seen as the ultimate standard of righteousness. The church is no longer representing the highest ethical standard. The church has been guilty of a lot of unethical practices. And so in this sense, a lot of humanists and philosophers are really kind of distancing themselves from the church, saying that there is a higher righteousness, a higher ethic that exists than the one that the church has been representing. The church has not made, apparently, human beings better people. The church has apparently not made the world a less violent place. We kind of mentioned this in earlier discussion here. And so on the one hand, these Enlightenment thinkers are considering this aspect. But there's another aspect that's important here too, and that is the problem of theodicy. Now, first of all, in all religions, since the beginning of civilization, humans have questioned why the world is not fair. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? I can imagine perfect justice. Why doesn't it exist? And if there is a God, why doesn't this God want the world to be fair? Why isn't this God, if he's controlling everything, why isn't he being fair? So some people use the term theodicy just to refer to our offense at the world not being fair, moral chaos. But theodicy is more properly used to how this problem becomes exacerbated in monotheism. Because in monotheism, you're supposed to have a God that is all-powerful and sovereign. He's controlling everything. But he's also supposed to be perfectly just and kind. So if he's perfectly just and kind, he does not want suffering to exist. He does not want evil to exist. If he wanted evil to exist, then technically he wouldn't be righteous. Now the problem is, when you take these two different aspects of God, it is impossible in our thinking to reconcile them. Obviously, many different forms of Christianity have answered this question in very different ways. In fact, Protestant Christianity is split right down the middle between two totally different ways of answering this question. But you're going to have to hang on to one of these aspects, one of the attributes of God more perfectly, and you're going to have to kind of redefine the other one if you want to somehow reconcile them in your thinking. But unless you're going to redefine or minimize one of them, you'll never reconcile them. Because the fact is, if God really is in control of everything, and God really doesn't want evil to exist, then evil would not exist. And it clearly does. This is a problem that has never been solved. In Christianity, we mentioned this actually in an earlier lecture when I was giving an example early on in the semester. The theological community we would call Calvinism hangs on more to the sovereignty of God, that God really is in control of everything. But if the way God exerts his control in some regard seems to be unrighteous or unkind or unjust, we're misunderstanding God's righteousness. God's righteousness is so far beyond us that we can't even really wrap our head around what it is. So we need to trust in the righteousness of God that we can't fully obtain. But again, the more sacred truth here for the Calvinist is the sovereignty of God. Now, if you take an Armenian, they kind of see it the other way around. God is good. God is kind. God doesn't want evil to exist. Now, on the other hand, they will say that God is sovereign, but they've kind of reinterpreted this a little bit. They've said that at this time in history, God in his sovereignty has chosen not to be sovereign because he set certain things in motion. And the world is kind of on a course towards the outcome that God knows is going to happen. And there's going to be a time in history, in the eschaton, the last days, where he is going to step in and take control again and fix all of these problems. But first, he has to kind of let everything play out the way it's going to play out until it gets to this perfect point in history where he has promised to step back in. So for an Armenian, what they've done is they hung on to the idea that God never wants evil to exist, never wants anything to be unjust, but to accomplish his ultimate purpose, he has had to, in his sovereignty, choose not to be sovereign for a while and kind of let things go the way they're going till they get to a point where he's going to step back in, and then he can perform some kind of a transformation that will result in the ultimate goal. And this is a very Armenian way of looking at it. Again, I mentioned this not in this depth, but in a previous lecture. Armenians would be more associated with a type of Protestant Christianity called Methodism. Calvinists would be a lot more associated with Reformed theology or Presbyterianism, if you will. And anyway, so this problem of theodicy is huge. And one of the things that deists realize too is that religion has never satisfactorily answered that question as to how we can imagine perfect justice, but why it doesn't exist. How God can be all-powerful and all-just, and yet why the world is in the state that it's in. So, with all of these things considered, I want to talk a bit about what a deist is. We're going to talk next about agnostics, but in any case, if I talk about a deist, an agnostic, an atheist, I want you to understand I am always talking about good people. I do not use dysfunctional people as examples of any ideal concept. We talk about deists, agnostic, atheists. I'm talking about educated people who have done their research, who are intellectual and deeply, deeply ethical. They are making decisions in terms of what they will believe, largely based on ethical reasons, whether it's in terms of the virtue ethics or whether it's in terms of consequentialism, if you understand anything about that, but they're deeply ethical people. So these are good people. So what deists are saying is they still believe there's a God that created the world, but they don't believe the God is still involved in the world, or the word is immanent. By the way, this is I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, not I-M-M-I. That word means something different, but immanent, involved, okay, perceived as being involved in the creation. Deists think God created the world, but he's withdrawn at some point, because if God really is all-powerful and God really is all good, there is no way in the world he would will for the world to be the way it is right now. Again, this is a deeply ethical way of thinking about things, holding on to all of these attributes of God, but saying there's no way to reconcile the chaos in the world and explain how it's God's will. Even today, there are a lot of people that are offended by people who are trying to explain how the horrible things happening are God's will. A good example of that would be 9/11. There was a popular fundamentalist preacher named Jerry Falwell that got on TV, on the TV show of, well, another popular evangelist who's still alive, really old now, named Pat Robertson. But Jerry Falwell got on his show and declared to America and the world that the reason God willed for 9/11 to happen is because of gay marriage and abortion and a whole bunch of other sins. So what he felt like he was doing was explaining why this righteous God was completely justified in allowing 9/11 to happen, or causing it to happen, or willing it to happen. You know, you can play with semantics there. But the idea was it was our own sin that caused God to will for 9/11 to be. The outcry against that was great, even among a lot of Falwell's own followers, and he had to retract that statement, and he went back on Pat Robertson's show and apologized and said, look, I spoke badly, this isn't what I really meant. By the way, you can find this video on YouTube easily if you want to. But first, let me tell you about another one. This one's more recent. This is, Falwell's gone now. He died a number of years back, but Pat Robertson's still around, still very old. But we had horrible earthquakes in Haiti about a decade ago. And Pat Robertson actually felt the need, according to this kind of prophetic tradition that's always represented here, humans speaking authoritatively for God, Pat Robertson felt like he needed to explain why the earthquakes in Haiti happened. And I can't remember the exact wording, but it had something to do with the leaders that established this nation having made some kind of a deal with the devil a century and a half ago, and finally Satan had come back to collect, and that was the reason for this. A lot of people today are offended when prophets or anointed people think that they can explain why God seems to be as unrighteous as he is, and less people are listening to these explanations and giving them any credibility. In fact, there are people that have left Christianity because they're sick of these kind of explanations, because it makes God look a lot more petty than he ought to be, makes him look a lot more unrighteous, a lot more reactive, a lot more prone to human emotions than he ought to be. And people are not willing to believe in a God that is less ethical than they are. I'll say that again. I can't believe in a God that is less ethical than I am. If he doesn't have at least as much sense of righteousness or compassion as I do, then how can I look up to him as an example of what it means to be ethical? And this is exactly what deists are saying. This attempt to try and explain God makes him look very, very unethical. So they've chosen to hang on to the idea of God as being sovereign, God as being deeply ethical, and so they have said there's no way that God can be involved in the world the way it is. Kind of refreshing. You no longer have to explain why God did what he did. Two examples of deists are Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. A lot of the founders of our nation were deists. Now, they're monotheists. They still believe God created the world. They see the evidence of intelligent design. They just don't believe God is actually pulling the strings, or he is actually causing things to be the way they are in the world today. They still believe there's going to be some kind of final judgment. So, certainly want to love your neighbor as yourself. But you can't explain all the crap happening in the world today, in some kind of prophetic way as to, well, the reason God willed this is so and so. They reject all this idea. Now, today we have a version of this that is called agnosticism. Now, you remember we talked about Gnosticism in a previous lecture. This has nothing to do with Gnosticism. The only reason it sounds like it is because it's using the same Greek word gnosis. When you put an A in front of something, it means not. So if I say I'm amoral, it means I'm not a moral person. That makes sense? So if I say I'm agnostic, first of all, when you put the A in front of it, the G finally gets pronounced. It's not silent as in gnosis or Gnosticism. But when I say agnostic, I'm saying without knowledge. And again, gnosis is that spiritual knowledge, that revelation from God of truth. Okay? So what agnostic really means is no spiritual revelation of God. Okay? Now, this is very similar to deism, believe it or not. The difference is agnostics won't even go so far as to say that you can prove that God exists. In fact, they make a very big point out of saying that you cannot prove that God exists. And of course they're right. All experience of God is subjective. If I have a very powerful experience of God, and nobody on earth could convince me I didn't have it, there's still no way that I can let you feel my feelings or think my thoughts and know that this is real. I can't prove it. Subjective experience is non-falsifiable. That's a scientific term that also means it's non-provable. So, you can't prove that God exists. You can't know certainly what God's will is either. Now again, this is responding to the same kind of thing. This is responding to people who claim to have certainty. How many people in the world are claiming to speak for God? A lot. Do they agree with each other? Rarely. So if you've got multitudes of people claiming prophetically to be speaking the word of God and saying who God hates or who he'll destroy or who are his chosen people, and they all disagree with each other, who is right? How many can be right? One? Well, if you had a few that totally agreed with each other, I guess more than one, but only one point of view can be right. So you have to decide who the correct prophet is in the midst of a multitude of false prophets. And you can kind of see the sad, tragic comedy of the prophetic tradition today. What an agnostic is saying is they immediately devalue whenever anybody claims to speak authoritatively for God. You can't even prove that God exists, so you certainly cannot prove or assert what God is thinking, what God's will is, or what God is like. And anybody that claims to have the knowledge or the power or the authority to tell you what God is like or what God's will is like is by definition wrong, simply because of their arrogance. Now, this actually has some things going for it. Again, when we looked back at what deists found problems with, it's the same kind of thing agnostics find problems with. They just don't feel like in any way they need to hang on to this whole monotheistic idea of God creating the earth. Back in the times where deism was born, If you were going to challenge the church, it was dangerous, but if you were at least still claiming to be a monotheist, you were on a little bit safer ground than if you decided to be, in some sense, agnostic. So agnosticism is saying the same kind of thing. Now, here's what you may not know. And again, I'm talking about educated, intellectual people who've done their research. They've researched different religions. They've researched the answers religion have given for the problem of theodicy, for the problem of suffering in the world, for the way God is working in the world. And due to deeply ethical reasons, they have decided they can't believe any of these because none of these explanations seem to indicate an ethical God. They can imagine a more ethical God than the one you're describing, so they certainly can't believe in this God that is petty enough to like this person and hate this person and tell this person to tell that person they're going to burn in hell. And this sounds more like human conflict than it does something that's going on in the mind of God, right? Almost as crazy as ancient polytheism with all the gods fighting each other and having their own little squabbles, but using the humans as pawns. So here's what you may not know about agnostics. The vast majority of agnostics think it is much more likely that a God exists than that a God doesn't exist. Much, much more likely. A lot of them would love to have some subjective experience of God themselves that would kind of lead them to say, well, I have a personal gnosis. But they would still hang on to the same idea that there's no way they could prove it to anyone else, and even their own idea of what happened on some level might be subject to a misunderstanding. Nobody speaks prophetically, authoritatively for God, or can define God perfectly. But still, I've known agnostics that have openly expressed their desire to have some kind of a true spiritual experience of God, where they could literally say, I'm technically not agnostic anymore. I have gnosis. I've had an experience of God. Second thing you may not know is that agnostics, one of the reasons they don't think anyone's speaking authoritatively for God is because they don't think humans are able to hear from God. God may be speaking. In fact, it may be God's nature to be speaking all the time. But we apparently don't do a very good job of hearing what God is saying because we can't seem to agree on what the message is. Now, pure logic. If there ever was a message from God that actually got through, that was interpreted correctly, logically speaking, that would be the message that is most agreed upon by all of the different religions and all the different religious leaders. Interestingly, all of the world religions do agree on one thing, and that is that the highest ethic is to love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. That which is grievous to you, don't do to another. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, granted, there is a problem with some people coming up with reasons why people they hate are not their neighbors, so they can relieve themselves from the responsibility of loving them, and that's another problem in itself we'll talk about later. But the fact of the matter is, whoever you consider your neighbor to be, that's the highest ethic in all of the world religions. So if there was ever a message that got through, that's probably the one. So there are actually a lot of agnostics that think, hey, you can't prove that God exists, you can't prove, what his will is, you can't say authoritatively what he said, but if ever a message from God got through, it's probably this one, that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So just on the off chance, or even the probable chance that God exists, it's probably very important that we take this highest ethic to heart. I can even myself acknowledge that this is the highest ethic I can conceive of. So if there was a God, I would associate that God as the origin of that ethic, if in fact ethics came from God at all. So there are actually some agnostics that think that, you may never have an experience of God in this life, but after you die, if there's a God, at that point you might meet that God. And so having been faithful to love your neighbor as yourself might be incredibly important. I'll just end by saying I know some people who fall in the category of agnostic that are some of the most deeply thoughtful and spiritual people I know. They just believe in a God beyond their comprehension and beyond any human idea of what God is like or what God's will is. Now let's go on. Atheism. Now I put the word philosophical here, and you'll see why in a moment. Technically, we've talked about philosophical agnosticism, philosophical deism, everything's philosophical. It's a way of thinking, okay? But I put philosophical atheism here because we're going to talk about something else in a second. Philosophical atheism means no God or higher order exists. We talked about this when we talked about the higher order. I will say one other thing about philosophical atheism here, and that is that philosophical atheism considers this incurably religious nature of human beings to be a terrible flaw. This part of us is still grabbing for the security blanket, so to speak. And atheists, and again, I'm talking about intelligent, educated people, ethical people, would hope that we would evolve past this superstitious religious belief, seeking answers for everything, because we make ourselves crazy, seeking these answers that don't exist or that you can't know for sure are the correct answer. So philosophical atheists don't believe there's a higher order or a higher reality where the answers to these questions of ultimate concern exist. Whereas the theist says, if I can ask this question and it's critical, the answer must exist somewhere. Or if I can desire this fulfillment and nothing in the world fulfills me, the most likely explanation is that I was made for another world. That's classic C.S. Lewis there, by the way. The atheist rejects this idea completely. The atheist thinks that this part of the human that makes them incurably religious, the homo religiosus part of the human, is a flaw. And they're hoping that all humanity will evolve past this flaw at some point, the survival held over from prehistoric humanity, to use anthropological terminology. And their second goal in their own life is to try to discipline themselves to get over this need to always ask why, as if there's some higher reason, to seek some higher meaning as if it already exists. Atheists recognize one thing that is true. We are order-seeking and order-producing, and we are the ones that create meaning. If someone I love dies a horrible death and it's not fair, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why it was that person at that time, I'm not going to let their death be reduced to a meaningless twist of fate. I want their death to mean something. If my significant other is killed by a drunk driver, I'll respond somehow to memorialize her life, and maybe I'll start a new chapter of PADD, Professors Against Drunk Driving or something, and make sure that she is remembered. Make sure that her life can be a blessing to other people, because that's what we do. We create meaning. We take things that are important to us and we make them meaningful. We establish that meaning, that purpose. So atheists agree that we do that, but they realize that we do it. Whereas religious people, we do it too, but we look to God and we search for some meaning that applies to the situation we've experienced that has already been established in the teaching and the theology of the religion that pertains to such a situation. And of course, as we've talked about before, the problem is all such answers are arbitrary. Whatever you feel like the paradigm is, when it breaks down, somebody has to give an ad hoc explanation, an arbitrary definition of why the paradigm broke down, and that's what religious leaders claim to have the wisdom or claim to have the anointing to be able to do, and they spend a great amount of their time doing that, answering those kinds of questions. Again, this is a little bit of a rehash. So, biggest difference between an atheist and a theist in terms of homo religiosus is the atheist sees this part of humanity as a flaw and wants to overcome it in their own life and hopes that humanity will evolve beyond it. The theist sees it very differently. The theist sees this part of themselves that knows that somewhere an answer must exist to these questions, that knows that somewhere perfect justice must exist because they can imagine it, that knows somewhere unconditional love must exist because they can think about the concept. This theist, this believer, thinks that the reason they believe these things is because there's part of them that still is either connected to this ultimate reality or is kind of, how should we call it, the image of God in us, something left over from this experience of this reality that we still seek. And so the theist doesn't see this religious part of us as being a flaw. The theist sees this as being the truest part of who we are, the most valuable part. The part that should be protected at all costs, the part that lives on after we die, our soul, our spirit, the image of God in us. And we'll protect this and cultivate this and champion this at all costs. So again, the atheist and the theist both agree humans are kind of incurably religious. But is that something that should be cultivated and protected, or is that a flaw that should be eliminated? Now, all I've done here is told you a little bit more about atheism. But again, atheists have concluded that no God exists, no higher order exists. There is no answer to these questions that are so crucial. Here's what you may not have thought before. If you have grown up in a sectarian church, and that's all you knew, you didn't have perspective. I mean, you couldn't look at situations from 15 different positions because you were taught to only see it from one position. You were taught to see the truth that was communicated to you within the walls of your religious establishment. And when you went out into the world, you probably believed that there were all kinds of lies and false wisdoms in the world, and it was your job to hang on to your faith, to your correct understanding, and not believe any of these deceptive beliefs. You came back to your religious community once or twice or 3 times a week to have the truth reinforced to you, and that's the truth you hung on to. Furthermore, in your life, you compared every wisdom that you saw, every truth you saw, with that truth that you knew was the true truth, the highest truth that you've been taught in your religious community. You compared everything with that. And the farther away a belief was from the truth that you knew, the more you judged it to be wrong. This is sectarianism in a nutshell, complete absence of perspective. And you don't gain perspective either because you're taught, don't try to see it from their point of view. If you listen to their wisdom and you try to see it from their point of view, somehow that deceptive wisdom is going to destroy your faith. It'll get a hold of you. And so some sectarians are actually pretty afraid of hearing other points of view. And we've talked about this before in the first lecture. If your faith is so fragile that you can't think of another point of view, I don't have much respect for your faith. I think your faith is going to be a lot more durable than that if it's founded on a real experience of the ultimate. Now, here's my point. When you only see from one point of view, you're judging everything by how far it is away from what you believe. So imagine you're part of a church where you're supposed to know that you're saved, and you're supposed to know that you know that you know that you know. That's not what all people believe, but there are some forms of Christianity that believe that. So imagine someone comes into your community and says, but you can't know for sure. How far is that from what you believe? A long way, right? Let's symbolically say it's 1,000 miles away from you. It's a long way away. It's so far in the distance you can barely even see this person standing. You know that you know, and they say you can't know, so huge distance. Now after this, someone comes in and says, there is no God at all. Well, how far is that from what you believe? That's even farther away, right? Let's symbolically call that 1,200 miles. Okay? So the agnostic is 1,000 miles away. The atheist is 1,200 miles away. Remember, you're seeing everything in a linear fashion. You're comparing how far everything is away from you. So you see the agnostic 1,000 miles away. You see the atheist 1,200 miles away, and you come to the very, very wrong conclusion that agnosticism is almost atheism. Nothing could be farther from the truth. You're thinking of it like you're going from Tampa, Florida to Nashville. And when you cross the border between Georgia and Tennessee, you might say, hey, we're 90% of the way there. It doesn't work that way, okay? 1,200 miles away from you, maybe. 1,000 miles away from you, maybe, but not in the same direction. Do you know what educated agnostics think about atheists? Most of them think they're complete idiots. Yes, fools. Imagine, the atheist says, there is no God. And the agnostic says, fool, you can't know that for sure, idiot. Those are the jaw drops of all of the sectarians that have never thought about this before. All right? When you say you can't know for sure if God exists, you can't know for sure that God doesn't exist either. So for an educated agnostic, a philosophical atheist is just as flawed in their belief as some preacher that thinks of all the people on earth, he's the one that really heard from God. They're both similar kinds of foolishness. Last thing we're going to talk about here has nothing to do with belief. Just, we're done talking about theistic belief. Now we're going to talk about practice. We're going to talk about practical atheism. Now, we've changed the meaning of the word practical, so practical means in practice. What we do. What we can be observed doing. That's our practice, okay? We think of practical as being feasible or possible, but practical really means practicable, Okay? If it's practical, it's practicable. It's able to be practiced. It's being practiced. Okay? Practical atheism has to do with the decisions you make in your life. If the decisions you're making have nothing to do with any idea of what God's will is, then technically they're atheistic decisions. They're decisions not made because of any theistic belief. Now again, we're not talking about your beliefs. You're not an atheist perhaps, but an atheistic practice is something you've decided to do that has nothing to do with what you think God's will is. When I leave college after teaching a class, there's 3 general different ways that I drive home, depending on what traffic is like. If I decide to go way number 2, because way number 1 is 5 minutes slower, and way number 3 has a crash on the interstate, that is an atheistic decision. It's an atheistic practice. I didn't choose that route because God told me to choose it, or because route number 2 was the holiest route. It had nothing to do with any theistic beliefs at all. It had to do with my desire to get home as quickly as I could after a long day. Does that make sense? I might be a devoted believer, but that practice was atheistic because it was not in any way decided because of an understanding I have of what God's will is. Right? So you can be a devoted believer and still, conceivably, the majority of the decisions you make during the day are atheistic decisions. They have nothing to do with God's will for your life. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because as much as agnostics and atheists, really don't agree, agnostics think atheists are kind of foolish, still, they are both predominantly falling in the category of practical atheism because their practices are not determined by any idea of God's will. Obviously, the practical atheist, the philosophical atheist, rather, is not. I mean, they don't even think God exists, so certainly God's will isn't designating what they do. The agnostic may think it's likely that God exists, but nobody can really know what his will is, so once again, they are not making decisions based on any idea that they know what God's will is for sure. Are you with me? Again, philosophically, theologically, very different, but in terms of practice, both predominantly atheistic. There might be one exception to the rule. If you had an agnostic that said, well, you can't know for sure what God's will is, but if any message ever got through, it's this message to love my neighbor as myself, so, as I am giving money to charity, I am actually mindful of the idea that, if I find out someday that a God does exist, it'll probably be a good thing that I did this. Now you can make the case that the agnostic is not being an atheist in practice. Even though they're not sure, they are considering the fact that this might be God's will. So that might be the exception to the rule. So practical atheism, again, your practices, your decisions are not based on an understanding of what God's will is. This concludes our lecture on theisms. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you soon.